The Story of Civilization, Volume 2, The Life of Greece, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 4, Side 2. He surprised everyone by making little change of detail in the Solonian constitution. Like Augustus, he knew how to adorn and support dictatorship with democratic concessions and forms. Archons were elected as usual, and the Assembly and the popular courts, the Council of 400 and the Senate of the Areopagus met and functioned as before, except that the suggestions of Pisistratus found a very favorable hearing. When a citizen accused him of murder, he appeared before the Senate and offered to submit to trial, but the complainant decided not to press the charge. Year by year, the people, in inverse proportion to their wealth, became reconciled to his rule. Soon they were proud of him, at last fond of him. Probably Athens had needed, after Solon, just such a man as Pisistratus, one with sufficient iron in his blood to beat the disorder of Athenian life into a strong and steady form, and to establish by initial compulsion those habits of order and law which are to a society what the bony structure is to an animal, its shape and strength, though not its creative life. When, after a generation, the dictatorship was removed, these habits of order and the framework of Solon's constitution remained as a heritage for democracy. Pisistratus, perhaps not knowing it, had come not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. His economic policies carried on that emancipation of the people which Solon had begun. He settled the agrarian question by dividing among the poor the lands that belonged to the state, as well as those of banished aristocrats. Thousands of dangerously idle Athenians were settled upon the soil, and for centuries afterward we hear of no serious agrarian discontent in Attica. He gave employment to the needy by undertaking extensive public works, building a system of aqueducts and roads, and raising great temples to the gods. He encouraged the mining of silver at Laurium, and issued a new and independent coinage. To finance these undertakings, he laid a 10% tax upon all agricultural products. Later, he seems to have reduced this to 5%. He planted strategic colonies on the Dardanelles, and made commercial treaties with many states. Under his rule, trade flourished, and wealth grew not among a few only, but in the community as a whole. The poor were made less poor, the rich not less rich. That concentration of wealth which had nearly torn the city into civil war was brought under control, and the spread of comfort and opportunity laid the economic bases of Athenian democracy. Under Pisistratus and his sons, Athens was physically and mentally transformed. Till their time it had been a second-rate city in the Greek world, lagging behind Miletus, Ephesus, Mytilene, and Syracuse in wealth and culture, in vitality of life and mind. Now new buildings of stone and marble reflected the radiance of the day. The old temple of Athena on the Acropolis was beautified with a Doric peristyle, and work was begun on that temple of Olympian Zeus, whose stately Corinthian columns, even in their ruins, brighten the road from Athens to her port. By establishing the Pan-Athenaic Games and giving them a Pan-Hellenic character, Pisistratus brought to his city not honor only, but the stimulus of foreign faces, competition, and ways. Under his rule, the Panathenaea became the great national festival, whose impressive ceremonial still moves on the frieze of the Parthenon. To his court, by public works and private beneficence, Pisistratus attracted sculptors, architects, and poets. In his palace was collected one of the earliest libraries of Greece. A committee appointed by him gave to the Iliad and the Odyssey the form in which we know them. Under his administration and encouragement, Thespis and others lifted drama from a mummer's mimicry to a form of art ready to be filled out by the great triumvirate of the Athenian stage. The tyranny of Pisistratus was part of a general movement in the commercially active cities of 6th century Greece to replace the feudal rule of a landowning aristocracy with the political dominance of the middle class in temporary alliance with the poor. Such dictatorships were brought on by the pathological concentration of wealth and the inability of the wealthy to agree on a compromise. Forced to choose, the poor, like the rich, love money more than political liberty, and the only political freedom capable of enduring is one that is so pruned as to keep the rich from denuding the poor by ability or subtlety, and the poor from robbing the rich by violence or votes. Hence the road to power in Greek commercial cities was simple: to attack the aristocracy, defend the poor, and come to an understanding with the middle classes. Arrived at power, the dictator abolished debts or confiscated large estates, taxed the rich to finance public works, or otherwise redistributed the over-concentrated wealth. And while attaching the masses to himself through such measures, he secured the support of the business community by promoting trade with state coinage and commercial treaties, and by raising the social prestige of the bourgeoisie. Forced to depend upon popularity instead of hereditary power, the dictatorships for the most part kept out of war, supported religion, maintained order, promoted morality, favored the higher status of women, encouraged the arts, and lavished revenues upon the beautification of their cities. And they did all these things, in many cases, while preserving the forms and procedures of popular government, so that even under despotism the people learned the ways of liberty. When the dictatorship had served to destroy the aristocracy, the people destroyed the dictatorship, and only a few changes were needed to make the democracy of freemen a reality as well as a form. 5. The establishment of democracy. When Pisistratus died in 527, he left his power to his sons. His wisdom had survived every test except that of parental love. Hippias gave promise of being a wise ruler, and for 13 years continued the policies of his father. Hipparchus, his younger brother, was harmlessly though expensively devoted to love and poetry, and it was at his invitation that Anacreon and Simonides came to Athens. The Athenians were not quite pleased to see the leadership of the state passed down without their consent to the young Pisistratids, and began to realize that the dictatorship had given them everything but the stimulus of freedom. Nevertheless, Athens was prosperous, and the quiet reign of Hippias might have gone on to a peaceful close had it not been for the unsmooth course of true Greek love. Aristogeiton, a man of middle age, had won the love of the young Harmodius, then, says Thucydides, in the flower of youthful beauty. But Hipparchus, equally careless of gender, also solicited the lad's love. When Aristogeiton heard of this, he resolved to kill Hipparchus, and at the same time, in self-protection, to overthrow the tyranny. Harmodius and others joined him in the conspiracy in 514. They murdered Hipparchus as he was arranging the Panathenaic procession, but Hippias eluded them and had them slain. To complicate the tale, a courtesan, Laina, mistress of Harmodius, died bravely under torture, having refused to betray the surviving conspirators. If we may believe Greek tradition, she bit off her tongue and spat it in the face of her torturers to make sure that she would not answer their questions. Though the people lent no visible support to this revolt, Hippias was frightened by it into replacing his hitherto mild rule with a regime of suppression, espionage, and terror. The Athenians, strengthened by a generation of prosperity, could afford now to demand the luxury of liberty. Gradually, as the dictatorship grew harsher, the cry for freedom grew louder, and Harmodius and Aristogeiton, who had conspired for love and passion rather than for democracy, were transformed by popular imagination into the martyrs of liberty. Off in Delphi, the Alcmeonids, who had been re-exiled by Pisistratus, saw their opportunity, raised an army, and marched upon Athens with the announced intention of deposing Hippias. At the same time, they bribed the Pythian oracle to tell all Spartans who consulted her that Sparta must overthrow the tyranny at Athens. Hippias successfully resisted the forces of the Alcmeonids, but when a Lacedaemonian army joined them, he withdrew to the Areopagus. Seeking the security of his children in the event of his own death, he sent them secretly out of Athens, but they were captured by the invaders, and Hippias, as the price of their safety, consented to abdication and exile in 510. The Alcmeonids, led by the courageous Cleisthenes, entered Athens in triumph, and on their heels came the banished aristocrats, prepared to celebrate the return of their property and their power. In the election that ensued, Isagoras, representing the aristocracy, was chosen to be chief archon. Cleisthenes, one of the defeated candidates, aroused the people to revolt, overthrew Isagoras, and set up a popular dictatorship. The Spartans again invaded Athens, seeking to restore Isagoras, but the Athenians resisted so tenaciously that the Spartans retired, and Cleisthenes, the Alcmeonid aristocrat, proceeded to establish democracy in 507. His first reform struck at the very framework of Attic aristocracy. Those 4 tribes and 360 clans whose leadership, by centuries of tradition, was in the hands of the oldest and richest families. Cleisthenes abolished this kinship classification and replaced it with a territorial division into 10 tribes, each composed of a varying number of demes. To prevent the formation of geographical or occupational blocks, such as the old parties of mountain, shore, and plain, each tribe was to be composed of an equal number of demes or districts from the city, from the coast, and from the interior. To offset the sanctity that religion had given to the old division, religious ceremonies were instituted for each new tribe or deme, and a famous ancient hero of the locality was made its deity or patron saint. Freemen of foreign origin, who had rarely been admitted to the franchise under the aristocratic determination of citizenship by descent, now automatically became citizens of the demes in which they lived. At one stroke the roll of voters was almost doubled, and democracy secured a new support and a broader base. Each of the new tribes was entitled to name one of the 10 strategoi, or generals, who now joined the polemarch in command of the army, and each tribe elected 50 members of the new Council of 501, which now replaced Solon's Council of 400 and assumed the most vital powers of the Areopagus. These councillors were chosen for a year's term, not by election but by lot, from the list of all citizens who had reached the age of 30 and had not already served 2 terms. In this strange inauguration of representative government, both the aristocratic principle of birth and the plutocratic principle of wealth were overridden by the new device of the lot, which gave every citizen an equal chance not only to vote, but to hold office in the most influential branch of the government. For the council so elected determined all matters and proposals to be submitted for approval or rejection to the assembly, reserved to itself various judicial powers, exercised wide administrative functions, and supervised all officials of the state. The assembly was enlarged by the access of new citizens, so that a full meeting of its membership would have meant an attendance of approximately 30,000 men. All these were eligible for service in the Heliaea, or courts, but the 4th class, or thetes, was still, as under Solon, ineligible to individual office. The powers of the assembly were enlarged by the institution of ostracism, which Cleisthenes seems to have added as a protection for the young democracy. At any time, by a majority of votes written secretly upon potsherds, or ostraca, the assembly, in a quorum of 6,000 members, might send into exile for 10 years any man who in its judgment had become a danger to the state. In this way, ambitious leaders would be stimulated to conduct themselves with circumspection and moderation, and men suspected of conspiracy could be disposed of without the law's delay. The procedure required that the assembly should be asked, "Is there any man among you whom you think vitally dangerous to the state? If so, whom?" The assembly might then vote to ostracize any one citizen, not excepting the mover of the motion. Such exile involved no confiscation of property and no disgrace. It was merely democracy's way of cutting off the tallest ears of corn. Nor did the assembly abuse its power. In the 90 years between the introduction of ostracism and its disuse at Athens, only 10 persons were banished by it from Attica. One of these, we are told, was Cleisthenes himself. But in truth we do not know his later history. It was absorbed and lost in the brilliance of his work. Beginning with a thoroughly unconstitutional revolt, he had established in the face of the most powerful families in Attica a democratic constitution that continued in operation with only minor changes to the end of Athenian liberty. The democracy was not complete. It applied only to freemen and still placed a modest property limitation upon eligibility to individual office. But it gave all legislative, executive, and judicial power to an assembly and a court composed of the citizens, to magistrates appointed by and responsible to the assembly, and to a council for whose members all citizens might vote, and in whose supreme authority, by the operation of the lot, at least 1/3 of them actually shared for at least a year of their lives. Never before had the world seen so liberal a franchise, or so wide a spread of political power. The Athenians themselves were exhilarated by this adventure into sovereignty. They realized that they had undertaken a difficult enterprise, but they advanced to it with courage and pride, and for a time with unwonted self-restraint. From that moment they knew the zest of freedom in action, speech, and thought, and from that moment they began to lead all Greece in literature and art, even in statesmanship and war. They learned to respect anew a law that was their own considered will, and to love with unprecedented passion a state that was their unity, their power, and their fulfillment. When the greatest empire of the age decided to destroy these scattered cities called Greece, or to lay them under tribute to the great king, it forgot that in Attica it would be opposed by men who owned the soil that they tilled, and who ruled the state that governed them. It was fortunate for Greece and for Europe that Cleisthenes completed his work, and Solon's, 12 years before Marathon. Chapter 6. The Great Migration. 1. Causes and Ways. In carrying the story of Sparta and Athens down to the eve of Marathon, we have sacrificed the unity of time to the unity of place. It is true that the cities of the mainland were older than the Greek settlements in the Aegean and Ionia, and that these cities in many cases sent out the colonies whose life we must now describe. But by a confusing inversion of normal sequences, Several of those colonies became greater than their mother cities and preceded them in the development of wealth and art. The real creators of Greek culture were not the Greeks of what we now call Greece, but those who fled before the conquering Dorians, fought desperately for a foothold on foreign shores, and there, out of their Mycenaean memories and their amazing energy, made the art and science, the philosophy and poetry that, long before Marathon, placed them in the forefront of the Western world. Greek civilization was inherited by the parent cities from their children. There is nothing more vital in the history of the Greeks than their rapid spread throughout the Mediterranean. They had been nomadic before Homer, and all the Balkan peninsula had seemed fluid with this movement, but the successive Greek waves that broke upon the Aegean Isles and the western coasts of Asia were stirred up above all by the Dorian invasion. From every part of Hellas men went out in search of homes and liberty beyond the grasp of the enslaving conquerors. Political faction and family feud in the older states contributed to the migration. The defeated sometimes chose exile, and the victors gave every encouragement to their exodus. Some of the Greek survivors of the Trojan War stayed in Asia. Others, through shipwreck or adventure, settled in the islands of the Aegean. Some, reaching home after a perilous journey, found their thrones or their wives occupied, and returned to their ships to build new homes and fortunes abroad. In mainland Greece, as in modern Europe, colonization proved a blessing in varied ways. It provided outlets for surplus population and adventurous spirits, and safety valves against agrarian discontent. It established foreign markets for domestic products, and strategic depots for the import of food and minerals. In the end, it created a commercial empire whose thriving interchange of goods, arts, ways, and thoughts made possible the complex culture of Greece. The migration followed 5 main lines: Aeolian, Ionian, Dorian, Euxine, Italian. The earliest began in the northern states of the mainland, which were the first to feel the brunt of the invasions from the north and the west. From Thessaly, Boeotis, Boeotia, and Aetolia, throughout the 12th and 11th centuries, a stream of immigrants moved slowly across the Aegean to the region about Troy, and founded there the 12 cities of the Aeolian League. The second line took its start in the Peloponnesus, whence thousands of Mycenaeans and Achaeans fled on the return of the Heraclids. Some of them settled in Attica, some in Euboea. Many of them moved out into the Cyclades, ventured across the Aegean, and established in western Asia Minor the 12 cities of the Ionian Dodecapolis. The third line was followed by Dorians, who overflowed the Peloponnesus into the Cyclades, conquered Crete and Cyrene, and set up a Dorian hexapolis around the island of Rhodes. The fourth line, starting anywhere in Greece, settled the coast of Thrace and built 100 cities on the shores of the Hellespont, the Propontis, and the Euxine Sea. The fifth line moved westward to what the Greeks called the Ionian Isles, thence across to Italy and Sicily, and finally to Gaul and Spain. Only a sympathetic imagination or a keen recollection of our own colonial history can visualize the difficulties that were surmounted in this century-long migration. It was an adventure of high moment to leave the land consecrated by the graves of one's ancestors and guarded by one's hereditary deities, and go forth into strange regions unprotected, presumably by the gods of Greece. Therefore the colonists took with them a handful of earth from their native state to strew upon the alien soil, and solemnly carried fire from the public altar of their mother city to light the civic fire at the hearth of their new settlement. The chosen site was on or near a shore, where ships, the second home of half the Greeks, might serve as a refuge from attack by land. Better still if it were a coastal plain protected by mountains that provided a barrier in the rear, an acropolis for defense in the town, and a promontory-sheltered harbor in the sea. Best of all if such a haven could be found on some commercial route or by a river mouth that received the products of the interior for export or exchange. Then prosperity was only a matter of time. Good sites were nearly always occupied and had to be conquered by stratagem or force. The Greeks in such matters recognized no morals loftier than our own. In some cases the conquerors reduced the prior inhabitants to slavery, with all the irony of pilgrims seeking freedom. More often they made friends of the natives by bringing them Greek gifts, charming them with a superior culture, courting their women, and adopting their gods. The colonial Greeks did not bother about purity of race, and could always find in their teeming pantheon some deity sufficiently like the local divinity to facilitate a religious entente. Above all, the colonists offered the products of the Greek handicrafts to the natives, secured grain, cattle, or minerals in return, and exported these throughout the Mediterranean, preferably to the metropolis or mother city from which the settlers had come, and to which they retained for centuries a certain filial piety. One by one these colonies took form until Greece was no longer the narrow peninsula of Homeric days, but a strangely loose association of independent cities, scattered from Africa to Thrace and from Gibraltar to the eastern end of the Black Sea. It was an epical performance for the women of Greece. We shall not always find them so ready to have children. Through these busy centers of vitality and intelligence, the Greeks spread into all of southern Europe the seeds of that subtle and precarious luxury called civilization, without which life would have no beauty and history no meaning. 2. The Ionian Cyclades. Sailing south from the Piraeus along the Attic coast and bearing east around Sunium's templed promontory, the traveler reaches the little isle of Ceos, C-E-O-S, where, if we may believe the incredible on the authority of Strabo and Plutarch, there was once a law that appears to have commanded those who were 60 years of age to drink hemlock in order that the food might be sufficient for the rest. And there was no memory of a case of adultery or seduction over a period of 700 years. Perhaps that is why her greatest poet exiled himself from Ceos after reaching middle age. He might have found it difficult to attain at home the 87 years that Greek tradition gives him. All the Hellenic world knew Simonides at 30, and when he died in 469 he was by common consent the most brilliant writer of his time. His fame as poet and singer won him an invitation from Hipparchus, co-dictator of Athens, at whose court he found it possible to live in amity with another poet, Anacreon. He survived the war with Persia, and was chosen again and again to write epitaphs for memorials of the honored dead. In his old age he lived at the court of Hieron I, dictator of Syracuse, and his repute was then so high that in 475 he made peace in the field between Hieron and Theron, dictator of Acragas, as hostilities were about to begin. Plutarch, in his perennially pertinent essay on Should Old Men Govern, tells us that Simonides continued to win the prize for lyric poetry and choral song into very old age. When finally he consented to die, he was buried at Acragas with the honors of a king. He was a personality as well as a poet, and the Greeks denounced and loved him for his vices and eccentricities. He had a passion for money, and his muse was dumb in the absence of gold. He was the first to write poetry for pay, on the ground that poets had as much right to eat as anyone else. But the practice was new to Greece, and Aristophanes echoed the resentment of the public when he said that Simonides would go to sea on a hurdle to earn a groat. He prided himself on having invented a system of mnemonics, which Cicero adopted gratefully. Its essential principle lay in arranging the things to be remembered into some logical classification and sequence, so that each item would naturally lead to the next. He was a wit, and his sharp repartees passed like a mental currency among the cities of Greece. But in his old age he remarked that he had often repented of speaking, but never of holding his tongue. We are surprised to find in the extant fragments of a poet so widely acclaimed and so liberally rewarded that indispersible gloom which broods over so much of Greek literature after Homer, in whose days men were too active to be pessimists and too violent to be bored. Few and evil are the days of our life, but everlasting will be our sleep beneath the earth. Small is the strength of man, and invincible are his errors. Grief treads upon the heels of grief through his short life, and death, whom no man escapes, hangs over him at last. To this come good and bad alike. Nothing human is everlasting. Well said the bard of Chios that the life of man is even as that of a green leaf. Yet few who hear this bear it in mind, for hope is strong in the breast of the young. When youth is in flower and the heart of man is light, he nurses idle thoughts, hoping he will never grow old or die. Nor does he think of sickness in good health. Fools are they who dream thus, nor know how short are the days of our youth and our life. No hope of blessed isles comforts Simonides, and the divinities of Olympus, like those of Christianity in some modern verse, have become instruments of poetry rather than consolations of the soul. When Hieron challenged him to define the nature and attributes of God, he asked for a day's time to prepare his answer, and the next day begged for 2 days more, and on each occasion doubled the period that he required for thought. When at last Hieron demanded an explanation, Simonides replied that the longer he pondered the matter, the more obscure it became. Out of Chaos came not only Simonides, but his nephew and lyric successor Bacchylides, and in Alexandrian days the great anatomist Pisistratus. We cannot say so much for Seriphos, or Andros, or Tinos, or Mykonos, or Sikanos, or Ios. On Syros lived Pherecydes, circa 550, who was reputed to have taught Pythagoras, and to have been the first philosopher to write in prose. On Delos, said Greek story, Apollo himself had been born. So sacred was the island as his sanctuary that both death and birth were forbidden within its borders. Those about to give birth or to die were hurriedly conveyed from its shores, and all known graves were emptied that the island might be purified. There, after the repulse of the Persians, Athens and her Ionian allies would keep the treasure of the Delian confederacy. There, every 4th year, the Ionians met in pious but convivial assemblage to celebrate the festival of the handsome god. A 7th century hymn describes the women with fine girdles, the eager merchants busy at their booths, the crowds lining the road to watch the sacred procession, the tense ritual and solemn sacrifice in the temple, the joyous dances, and the choral hymns of Delian and Athenian maidens chosen for their comeliness as well as their song, the athletic and musical contests, and the plays in the theater under the open sky. Annually, the Athenians sent an embassy to Delos to celebrate Apollo's birthday, and no criminal might be executed in Athens until this embassy's return. Hence the long interval, so fortunate for literature and philosophy, between the conviction of Socrates and his execution. Naxos is the largest, as Delos is almost the smallest, of the Cyclades. It was famous for its wine and its marble, and became rich enough in the 6th century to have its own navy and its own school of sculpture. Southeast of Naxos lies Amorgos, home of the unamiable Simonides, whose ungallant satire on women has been carefully preserved by man-written history. Simonides compares women now to foxes, asses, pigs, and the changeful sea, and swears that no husband has ever passed through a day without some word of censure from his wife. To the west lies Paros, almost composed of marble. Its citizens made their homes of it, and Praxiteles found there the translucent stone which he would carve and polish into the warmth and texture of human flesh. On this island, about the end of the 8th century, Archilochus was born, son of a slave woman, but one of the greatest lyric singers of Greece. A soldier's fortune led him north to Thasos, where, in a battle with the natives, he found his heels more valuable than his shield. He took to the one and abandoned the other, and lived to turn many a merry quip about his flight. Back in Paros, he fell in love with Neobule, daughter of the rich Lycambes. He describes her as a modest lass with tresses falling over her shoulders, and sighs, as so many centuries have sighed, only to touch her hand. But Lycambes, admiring the poet's verses more than his income, put an end to the affair, whereupon Archilochus aimed at him and Neobule and her sister such barbs of satiric verse that all 3 of them, legend assures us, hanged themselves. Archilochus turned his back sourly upon the figs and fishes of Paros, and became again a soldier of fortune. Finally, his heels having failed him, he was killed in battle against the Naxians. We learn from his poems that he was a man of rough speech to both friends and foes, with the disappointed lover's penchant for adultery. We picture him as an inspired pirate, a melodious buccaneer, coarse in prose and polished in verse, taking the iambic meter already popular in folk songs and fashioning it into short and stinging lines of 6 feet. This was the iambic trimeter that would become the classic medium of Greek tragedy. He experimented gaily with dactylic hexameters, trochaic tetrameters, and a dozen other meters, and gave to Greek poetry the metrical forms that it would keep to the end. Longfellow's Evangeline, his Hiawatha, and the final line of each stanza in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Byron may serve as examples, respectively, of dactylic hexameter, trochaic tetrameter, and iambic trimeter. Only a few broken lines survive, and we must accept the word of the ancients that he was the most popular of all Greek poets after Homer. Horace loved to imitate his technical diversities, and the great Hellenistic critic Aristophanes of Byzantium, when asked which of Archilochus's poems he liked best, voiced in 2 words the feeling of Greece, when he answered, "the longest." A morning's sail west of Paros is Sifnos, famous for its mines of silver and gold. These were owned by the people through their government. The yield was so rich that the island could set up at Delphi the Sifnian treasury with its placid caryatides, erect many another monument, and yet distribute a substantial balance among the citizens at the end of every year. In 524, a band of freebooters from Samos landed on the island and exacted a tribute of 100 talents, the equivalent of $600,000 today. The rest of Greece accepted this heroic robbery with the equanimity and fortitude with which men are accustomed to bear the misfortunes of their friends. 3. The Dorian overflow. The Dorians, too, colonized the Cyclades and tamed their warlike spirits to terrace the mountain slopes patiently, that the parsimonious rain might be held and coaxed to nourish their crops and vines. In Melos they took over from their Bronze Age predecessors the quarrying of obsidian, and made the island so prosperous that the Athenians, as we shall see, spared no pains to Melos to win its support in the struggle with Sparta. Here, in 1820, was found that Aphrodite of Melos, or as we know it from the Roman name of the goddess and the Italian name of the island, the Venus de Milo, which is now the most famous statue in the Western world. Moving east and then south, the Dorians conquered Thera and Crete, and from Thera sent a further colony to Cyrene. A few of them settled in Cyprus, where, from the 11th century, a small colony of Arcadian Greeks had struggled for mastery against the old Phoenician dynasties. It was one of these Phoenician kinglets, Pygmalion, of whom legend told how he so admired an ivory Aphrodite carved by his hands that he fell in love with it, begged the goddess to give it life, and married his creation when the goddess complied. The coming of iron probably lessened the demand for Cyprian copper and left the island off the main line of Greek economic advance. The cutting of the timber by the natives to burn the copper ore, by the Phoenicians for ships and by the Greeks for agricultural clearings, slowly transformed Cyprus into the hot and half-barren derelict that it is today. The art of the island, like its population, was in the Greek period a medley of Egyptian, Phoenician, and Hellenic influences, and never attained a homogeneous character of its own. The Dorians were but a minority of the Greek population in Cyprus, but in Rhodes and the southern Sporades, and on the adjoining mainland, they became the ruling class. Rhodes prospered in the centuries between Homer and Marathon, though its zenith would not come till the Hellenistic age. On a promontory jutting out from Asia, Dorian settlers developed the city of Cnidus, well situated to be a port of the coastal trade. Here the astronomer Eudoxus would be born, and the historian, or fabulist, Ctesias, and that Sostratus who was to build the Pharos at Alexandria. Here among the ruins of ancient temples would be found the sad and matronly Demeter of the British Museum. Opposite Cnidus lay the island of Kos, home of Hippocrates, and rival of Cnidus as a center of Greek medical science. Apelles the painter would be born here, and Theocritus the poet. A little to the north on the coast was Halicarnassus, birthplace of Herodotus and royal seat in Hellenistic days of the Carian king Mausolus and his fond Artemisia. This city, with Kos and Cnidus and the chief towns of Rhodes, Lindus, Camyrus, and Dialysus, formed the Dorian Hexapolis, or 6 cities of Asia Minor, weak rivals for a time of the 12 cities of Ionia. 4. The Ionian Dodecapolis. 1. Miletus and the birth of Greek philosophy. Running northwest of Caria for some 90 miles was the strip of mountainous coastland, 20 to 30 miles wide, anciently known as Ionia. Here, said Herodotus, the air and climate are the most beautiful in the whole world. Its cities lay for the most part at the mouths of rivers or at the ends of roads that carried the goods of the hinterland down to the Mediterranean for shipment everywhere. Miletus, southernmost of the Ionian 12, was in the 6th century the richest city of the Greek world. The site had been inhabited by Carians from Minoan days, and when about 1000 B.C. the Ionians came there from Attica, they found the old Aegean culture, though in a decadent form, waiting to serve as the advanced starting point of their civilization. They brought no women with them to Miletus, but merely killed the native males and married the widows. The fusion of cultures began with the fusion of blood. Like most of the Ionian cities, Miletus submitted at first to kings who led them in war, then to aristocrats who owned the land, then to tyrants representing the middle class. Under the dictator Thrasybulus, at the beginning of the 6th century, industry and trade reached their peak, and the growing wealth of Miletus flowered forth in literature, philosophy, and art. Wool was brought down from the rich pasture lands of the interior and turned into clothing in the textile mills of the city. Taking a lesson from the Phoenicians and gradually bettering their instruction, Ionian merchants established colonies as trading posts in Egypt, Italy, the Propontis, and the Euxine. Miletus alone had 80 such colonies, 60 of them in the north. From Abydos, Cyzicus, Sinope, Olbia, Trapezus, and Dioscurius, Miletus drew flax, timber, fruit, and metals, and paid for these with the products of her handicrafts. The wealth and luxury of the city became a proverb and a scandal throughout Greece. Milesian merchants, overflowing with profits, lent money to enterprises far and wide, and to the municipality itself. They were the Medici of the Ionian Renaissance. It was in this stimulating environment that Greece first developed two of its most characteristic gifts to the world, science and philosophy. The crossroads of trade are the meeting place of ideas, the attrition ground of rival customs and beliefs. Diversities beget conflict, comparison, thought. Superstitions cancel one another, and reason begins. Here in Miletus, as later in Athens, were men from 100 scattered states, mentally active through competitive commerce, and freed from the bondage of tradition by long absences from their native altars and homes. Milesians themselves traveled to distant cities and had their eyes opened by the civilizations of Lydia, Babylonia, Phoenicia, and Egypt. In this way, among others, Egyptian geometry and Babylonian astronomy entered the Greek mind. Trade and mathematics, foreign commerce and geography, navigation and astronomy developed hand in hand. Meanwhile, wealth had created leisure. An aristocracy of culture was growing up in which freedom of thought was tolerated because only a small minority could read. No powerful priesthood, no ancient and inspired text limited men's thinking. Even the Homeric poems, which were to become in some sense the Bible of the Greeks, had hardly taken yet a definite form. And in that final form, their mythology was to bear the imprint of Ionian skepticism and scandalous merriment. Here, for the first time, thought became secular and sought rational and consistent answers to the problems of the world and man. Nevertheless, the new plant, mutation though it was, had its roots and ancestry. The hoary wisdom of Egyptian priests and Persian magi, perhaps even of Hindu seers, the sacerdotal science of the Chaldeans, the poetically personified cosmogony of Hesiod, were mingled with the natural realism of Phoenician and Greek merchants to produce Ionian philosophy. Greek religion itself had paved the way by talking of Moira, or fate, as ruler of both gods and men. Here was that idea of law, as superior to incalculable personal decree, which would mark the essential difference between science and mythology, as well as between despotism and democracy. Man became free when he recognized that he was subject to law. That the Greeks, so far as our knowledge goes, were the first to achieve this recognition and this freedom in both philosophy and government is the secret of their accomplishment and of their importance in history. Since life proceeds by heredity as well as by variation, by stabilizing custom as well as by experimental innovation, it was to be expected that the religious roots of philosophy would form as well as feed it, and there should remain in it to the very end a vigorous element of theology. Two currents run side by side in the history of Greek philosophy, one naturalistic, the other mystical. The latter stemmed from Pythagoras and ran through Parmenides, Heraclitus, Plato, and Cleanthes to Plotinus and St. Paul. The other had its first world figure in Thales and passed down through Anaximander, Xenophanes, Protagoras, Hippocrates, and Democritus to Epicurus and Lucretius. Now and then some great spirit, Socrates, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, merged the two currents in an attempt to do justice to the unformulable complexity of life. But even in these men, the dominant strain, characteristic of Greek thought, was the love and pursuit of reason. Thales was born about 640, probably at Miletus, reputedly of Phoenician parentage, and derived much of his education from Egypt and the Near East. Here, as if personified, we see the transit of culture from east to west. He appears to have engaged in business only so far as to provide himself with the ordinary goods of life. Everyone knows the story of his successful speculation in oil presses. Let Aristotle tell the story. They say that Thales, perceiving by his skill in astronomy, that there would be great plenty of olives that year, while it was yet winter, hired at a low price all the oil presses in Miletus and Chios, there being no one to bid against him. But when the season came for making oil, many persons wanting them, he all at once let them upon what terms he pleased, and raising a large sum of money by that means, convinced them that it was easy for philosophers to be rich if they chose it. For the rest, he gave himself to study, with the absorbed devotion suggested by the tale of his falling into a ditch while watching the stars. Despite his solitude, he interested himself in the affairs of his city, knew the dictator Thrasybulus intimately, and advocated the federation of the Ionian states for united defense against Lydia and Persia. To him, tradition unanimously ascribed the introduction of mathematical and astronomical science into Greece. Antiquity told how, in Egypt, he calculated the heights of the pyramids by measuring their shadows when a man's shadow equaled his height. Returning to Ionia, Thales pursued the fascinatingly logical study of geometry as a deductive science and demonstrated several of the theorems later collected by Euclid: that a circle is bisected by its diameter, that the angles at the base of any isosceles triangle are similar, that is, equal, that the angle in a semicircle is a right angle, that the opposite angles formed by two intersecting straight lines are equal, that two triangles having two angles and one side respectively equal are themselves equal. As these theorems founded Greek geometry, so his studies of astronomy established that science for Western civilization and disentangled it from its Oriental associations with astrology. He made several minor observations and startled all Ionia by successfully predicting an eclipse of the sun for May 28, 585 BC, probably on the basis of Egyptian records and Babylonian calculations. For the rest, his theory of the universe was not appreciably superior to the current cosmology of the Egyptians and the Jews. The world, he thought, was a hemisphere resting on an endless expanse of water, and the earth was a flat disk floating on the flat side of the interior of this hemisphere. We are reminded of Goethe's remark that a man's vices or errors are common to him with his epoch, but his virtues or insights are his own. As some Greek myths made Oceanus the father of all creation, so Thales made water the first principle of all things, their original form and their final destiny. Perhaps, says Aristotle, he had come to this opinion from observing that the nutriment of everything is moist, and that the seeds of everything have a moist nature, and that from which everything is generated is always its first principle. Or perhaps he believed that water was the most primitive or fundamental of the three forms, gas, liquid, solid, into which, theoretically, all substances may be changed. The significance of his thought lay not in reducing all things to water, but in reducing all things to one. Here was the first monism in recorded history. Aristotle describes Thales' view as materialistic, but Thales adds that every particle of the world is alive, that matter and life are inseparable and one, that there is an immortal soul in plants and metals as well as in animals and men. The vital power changes form but never dies. Thales was wont to say that there is no essential difference between living and dead. When someone sought to nettle him by asking why then he chose life instead of death, he answered, because there is no difference. In his old age he received by common consent the title of Sophos, or sage, and when Greece came to name its 7 wise men, it placed Thales first. Being asked what was very difficult, he answered in a famous apothegm, to know thyself. Asked what was very easy, he answered, to give advice. To the question, what is God? He replied, that which has neither beginning nor end. Asked how men might live most virtuously and justly, he answered, if we never do ourselves what we blame in others. He died, says Diogenes Laertius, while present as a spectator at a gymnastic contest, being worn out with heat and thirst and weakness, for he was very old. Thales, says Strabo, was the first of those who wrote on physiologia, that is, on the science of nature, physis, or on the principle of being and development in things. His work was vigorously advanced by his pupil, Anaximander, who, though he lived from 611 to 549 BC, expounded a philosophy surprisingly like that which Herbert Spencer, trembling before his own originality, published in AD 1860. The first principle, says Anaximander, was a vast, indefinite infinite, or a pyrrhon, a boundless mass, possessing no specific qualities but developing by its inherent forces into all the varied realities of the universe. This book is continued on Cassette 5, Side 1.